How to create depth in your watercolour paintings are questions I get asked quite a lot. To achieve the depth in your landscapes especially, you can use something called aerial or atmospheric perspective. And there's lots of different techniques that you can use, and I'm going to try and cover them all in this tutorial. If you like this tutorial and you'd like to see more like it and you haven't already, why not subscribe to my channel so you will get updates of my latest tutorials. So, shall we get started? This is the gorgeous photograph that I'm going to be using as a reference. You can see I've got some distance there, some middle ground and some gorgeous foreground. A link for this photograph can be found in the description below. For a full list of all the materials I'm using, colours and colour alternative, you can also find these in the description below, along with Amazon links if you'd like to purchase any of the materials. For the longer, more in-depth tutorial, why not check out my Patreon membership? Details about that can be found in the description below, but you'll get lots more bonus content, voiceovers. The tutorials are ad-free, and you can also get access to a downloadable sketch. If you have any questions about that, don't hesitate to ask me. As you can see, I've masked out the daisies and the Queen Anne's lace. I've painted the sky wet in wet using my size 6 brush. I've also wet the water area as well, and I'm painting this wet in wet with a mixture of ultramarine with a pinch of pink, any pink will do, and a tiny bit of burnt sienna. So aerial or atmospheric perspective are tools that you can use to create depth, especially in landscape painting. So the first technique I'm using here is tonal value, and that's the lights and darks of objects. So in the distance I've used softer, paler tones like I have in the sky and also in the water. In the distance, as I come into the middle ground, my tones will get a little bit stronger. As you come in the foreground, you can get really strong lights and contrasting darks, and this really does create the illusion of depth in your painting. So you're painting on a 2D surface, but you're creating the look of 3D. So I've allowed my painting to dry, so I'm painting the furthest distant hill first of all using my size 10 brush, working wet on dry, and I've used the same mix, the ultramarine, with a touch of pink and a touch of the burnt sienna, and I'm just softening just below that there so you won't have a hard edge when you paint your next mountain or hill. So I'm just adding a smidge of turquoise there. You could use Prussian blue just at the very sort of distant hill there, and I'm diluting the edge of that there, so I'm just losing the hard edge. While that's drying off, I've mixed up a little bit of turquoise and permanent yellow, but you could use Prussian blue and lemon yellow or cadmium yellow, and I'm painting this wet on wet with my size 10 brush in the foreground. Just make sure your masking fluid is dry. If you don't have masking fluid, you could use white gouache instead at the end of the painting. So I'm just putting a little bit more yellow in there as well and letting my brush dance around. For the trees behind the daisies and the Queen Anne's lace, I mixed up a little bit of ultramarine with some Quinacridone gold and just painting this wet on wet also. So these colours are a lot brighter than the distant colours here, and when you're using colours, technique number 2 is to use sort of warmer colours in the foreground, and as you can see in the distance there, I've used cooler colours, and cooler colours appear to recede and warmer ones come forward, so lots of yellows and reds and browns. And also you can see I'm using darker tonal values here, wet into wet, using the turquoise with the burnt sienna. If you'd like to know a little bit more about warm and cool colours, I will put a link for a video that I published recently all about warm and cool colours, and you can find the link for that in the description below. As you can see, I'm putting contrasting tonal values in around the foreground here, because once I take the masking fluid off, I'm going to have white daisies and I have a really dark background around them, and it really pulls them forward and creates depth. So I'm just dropping in this luscious dark green, wet into wet. So when I take off my masking fluid later, I'm going to have hard edges, and hard edges come forward because they're quite detailed and they're almost textured in a way because they've got a lovely dark rim around them. Soft edges, wet into wet, especially if you look at the sky in the distance, it's softer and it recedes because it's got fuzzy edges. Watercolour is brilliant for creating depth just by using the soft wet and wet edges and, well, these fuzzy edges and the crisp hard edges of wet in wet. As you can see here, I'm using my sponge with some creamy green paint, and I'm using the edges that again just on the very edge here to create crisp texture. So texture also creates depth in painting, and as you can see here, it brings those trees and bushes forward away from the water. It's more kind of my middle ground here, but I want to bring that forward. As you can see, I'm also using a plastic card here cut up. It's just an old store card. I'm scratching into the surface of the paper, which is permanent, but this creates texture, and this also brings the foreground forward. So try to avoid putting texture in your distance because it will make your painting look flat. It will just pull it forward. As you can see here, I'm actually sprinkling on some table salt. You can use sea salt around the middle ground and in the foreground, again to create some textures in your painting. Now I've dried off my painting again, and I'm painting the next hill, slightly darker but still cooler than the distant mountain here, but I don't want the darks to be as strong because I'm going to put another dark in front of it to create this depth. But you can see how this pulls away from the distant mountain with the stronger tone, but also it's a bigger size, and size really does create distance. So objects appear smaller in the distance and larger in the middle ground, and then even bigger in the foreground. So that really will help you create depth in your painting by making objects bigger. So I'm just bringing this down to the water's edge here using this sort of cooler colour with my size 10 brush, and then just softening underneath. I'm mixing up a little bit of yellow and turquoise here, and it's a kind of a yellow green, and I'm just painting underneath this area here, and I'm just going to bring this right down to the left hand side, wet on dry with my size 10 brush. Also notice this is a warmer colour, the yellow with the blue there. It's much brighter and comes forward. I'm just painting the land here, the little islands here, wet on dry as well, using a mixture of the yellow and the turquoise. It's not as bright as the land on the left hand side because it's a little bit further away. I've just painted the centre islands there as well, and putting a tiny bit of shadow or reflection just underneath there, just to soften, to make that look a little bit more 3D as well. I'm just using a little bit of shadow just along the edge here to create some depth there with my size 10 brush. It's just a darker green, the ultramarine with some Quinacridone gold. You could use raw sienna, and as you can see here, this little bit of shadow colour here creates a little bit of depth, but it's it gets pushed away because obviously the edges are soft, so it doesn't come forward too much. The painting has dried again. I'm using a slightly stronger, darker tonal value here, but I've used ultramarine and a little bit of yellow and not the turquoise. The turquoise is a much brighter, stronger colour, very vibrant, so the ultramarine doesn't come forward as much. Otherwise it will flatten the painting also, and I'm keeping this colour quite cool but darker in tonal value, so it comes forward away from those distant mountains, but the slightly warmer colours, see where I'm coming with all this, comes forward. So it's all these little things that make such a difference. And as you can see here, I'm just painting on a little bit of textures and details here in this middle distance. I'm going to soften it back a bit. It is wet on dry, and it's the ultramarine with the yellow again, but I'm just softening underneath using that soft edge to push it back a little bit, because obviously all the details and textures and hard edges are going to be right in the foreground, but I want enough detail here so this pulls away from the distance. So I hope that makes sense. I'm doing the same as well to this little island here, pulling this forward away from the distance, but not too much detail that it comes forward too much. I'm just brushing off the salt now. As you can see, it's created some lovely light and texture there, especially in the middle ground. And I am sponging wet on dry to create some texture just at the top of those trees and bushes there. Again, to pull that away from the sky and away really from those sort of the water and the sort of distant hills. And I'm sponging lots more dark as well around the daisies and the Queen Anne lace to really have that contrast. When I take off that masking fluid, I'm going to have some real yummy darks against light, because it's kind of my focal point here. So it's really important to have that. I'm just spritzing some of the darks here with my spritzer bottle to soften them, but also I'm going to add some Brusho, which is a medium I really like to use to create some textures also. If you've not heard of Brusho and you want to know a little bit more about it, I'll put a link for a video I made in the description below all about Brusho. I've dried my painting thoroughly before I took off all of my masking fluid, and I did that with a paper towel. And I am delighted how the Queen Anne's lace has turned out, and the daisies, of course. And I'm painting now some sunny yellow. Look like little fried eggs here in the foreground. But this sunny, warm colour, think of the sunshine, comes forward and really creates depth and pulls away from that middle distance and the background. And this detail as well that I'm creating with the stems and the leaves will also come forward. So details come forward and create depth in your painting. So less details in the distance also creates depth because it recedes. So I hope that you find that helpful as well, to create depth in your painting. What I'm doing now is I'm spattering, but think of spattering as lots of tiny little bits of detail to create the look of the Queen Anne's lace. It's quite nice to do. I'm using white Winsor & Newton gouache. It's an opaque medium, and it's really useful, especially if you've lost your light or you don't want to use masking fluid, and you can use the white gouache instead. Sometimes painting round something like this is very tricky to do, so it's a great alternative. And the other great thing about this white border, it gives me time to assess to see if I need to do any more to my painting. As you can see, I did do quite a bit more, especially in the foreground, to create more details and to create more depth. This bonus footage will be available on the memberships, along with a colour mixing exercise to help you choose the right colours for this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I really hope you found it helpful, especially creating depth in your landscape watercolour paintings. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you again for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.